Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session. On behalf of the organisers, the International Maritime Organisation, the Government of Kenya, United for Wildlife, Traffic, the UNDP GEF project, Reducing Maritime Trafficking and Wildlife Between Africa and Asia under the Global Wildlife Programme, and WWF. I would like to welcome everyone and thank you very much for joining us. Specifically today, we're going to be looking at accelerating action against wildlife trafficking in international maritime supply chains. I'm delighted that we've had over 300 registrations across multiple sectors: intergovernmental organisations, government, law enforcement, private sector and NGOs. So clearly this is a topic of great interest at the moment. My name is Rob Campbell. I'm the lead for United for Wildlife, which is the Royal Foundation and the Duke of Cambridge's main conservation vehicle for combating the illegal wildlife trade, and I'll be moderating this event today. I should make a note that the illegal wildlife trade, for those who are unfamiliar with this topic in general, is often abbreviated to IWT, so worth noting if that comes up. We have some really fantastic speakers today, and you can see them here. We're going to be hearing about the sheer scale of wildlife trafficking within international maritime supply chains. We'll get the details of Kenya's recent proposal on the development guidelines for prevention and suppression of smuggling of wildlife on ships engaged in international maritime traffic. Importantly, this will be discussed at the upcoming IMO's FAL 44 meeting. And finally, we'll hear from one of the world leading shipping companies, Maersk, on how the private sector are fighting IWT. I think it's pertinent we cover these topics now, following last week's release of the UN Global Biodiversity Outlook report. In terms of wildlife, one of the points raised in the report outlined this period of time being the 6th mass extinction that we're going through. And with wildlife populations dropping by more than 2/3 since 1970. So there really never has been a more important time to be addressing these issues. But before we really kick off, I'm really pleased to say that we've got a great speaker who's going to give us some introductory remarks. But I just go through a quick administration. So we're going to hear from the speakers, then we're going to have a Q&A. And throughout the session, please feel free to access the Q&A function. It should be at the bottom of your screen. You hover over the slide and it should come up at the bottom. You click on that and it'll give you options for a question, and it'll say answered. And so I would suggest that if you want to ask a question, then you go in the box and it's already been asked, that you can vote for questions that are very similar to yours. And that would really help us on the back end of this decide which are the sort of priority questions and which are the ones most pertinent and most in demand for answering. It also, if it's aimed at a specific person, please add that. Otherwise we can work it out as we go along. And I'd also strongly encourage you to use the chat function. So introduce yourself, post suggestions or links to report as relevant to some of the reports as relevant to the discussions. And our team will, as I say, our team will be monitoring both throughout. So, the more interaction, the better, really. And now, before we start, as I said, I'm really pleased we've got an introduction from the IMO, Chris Trelawney, who's the Acting Director, Technical Cooperation Division at IMO. So Chris, if you'd like to give us a few words, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. On behalf of the Secretary General of the International Maritime Organization, Mr. Keetak Lim, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this very important event. For those of you not familiar with our work, IMO is a specialized agency of the United Nations with a role to create a regulatory framework for the safety, security, environmental performance of international shipping that is fair and effective, globally adopted, universally implemented, and consistently enforced. Trafficking of wildlife affects numerous species: pangolins, elephants, birds, turtles, tigers, bears, and many more. This is a crime which threatens not only our environment and biodiversity, but also human health, economic development, and security. The recently published United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime World Wildlife Crime Report for 2020 highlighted the potential for such crimes to increase the risk of transmission of zoonotic diseases caused by pathogens that spread from animals to humans. Pangolins have been identified as a potential source of coronaviruses and are the most trafficked wild animals in the world. While IMO is not the lead agency for the prevention and suppression of the illegal wildlife trade or the smuggling of drugs, the involvement of ships in illicit trade is clearly of interest, since one of our main objectives is to enhance global facilitation and security of international maritime transport. Furthermore, IMO is committed to achieving the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. SDG 15 aims to halt biodiversity loss and urges action to end poaching and trafficking of protected species and to address both demand and supply of illegal wildlife products. IMO's important facilitation committee deals with matters related to the facilitation of international maritime traffic, such as harmonizing and simplifying formalities, documentary requirements, and procedures for ships' arrival, stay, and departure from ports. These activities are regulated and streamlined by an international treaty called the Convention on the Facilitation of International Maritime Traffic, or Facilitation Convention, which contains mandatory standards and recommended practices to ensure a unified and global approach to the facilitation of international shipping. As you've heard, the next session of the Facilitation Committee, meeting remotely next week, is expected to discuss draft amendments to the FAL Convention to address illicit trade in wildlife. We also have on the table a proposal from Kenya to develop guidelines for the prevention and suppression of the smuggling of wildlife on ships engaged in international maritime traffic. You'll hear much more about this later on in the webinar. Such measures will undoubtedly help the global fight against the trafficking of wildlife, and we can do more by strengthening collaboration between agencies, authorities, and the private sector at international and local levels. IMO is pleased to collaborate with other partners and stakeholders in this matter. IMO is a signatory to the Buckingham Palace Declaration and is working with the United for Wildlife Transport Task Force, which brings together transport stakeholders, including the maritime sector and ports, along with law enforcement and other agencies to identify and facilitate action led by the private sector. And this webinar itself is another good example of collaborative work to accelerate action against wildlife trafficking through international supply chains, and I look forward to hearing the outcomes of your discussions. Thank you very much, and good luck.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, it's IMO, obviously an absolute principal partner here. So to get going, I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Steve Broad is the Executive Director of Traffic, a lot of you will be familiar with, which is a leading NGO working globally on wildlife trade in the context of both biodiversity and conservation and biodiversity conservation and sustainable development. Steve is going to provide some context setting on wildlife trafficking in the international maritime transport. And then we'll go into an immediate, fairly short Q&A where we can post questions directly to Steve before going into our next two speakers. Steve, over to you.
Thanks, Rob. And yeah, thanks everyone for joining us for this webinar today. So my task is to give a bit of background in terms of an introduction to the issue and the relevance to the maritime transport sector. And so I'll jump in and do that, and hopefully I have control of these slides. Here we go, not like that. Here we go. So wildlife trafficking, as many on the call will know, wildlife trafficking is a serious problem. A serious problem relative to other areas of illicit trade. It's often referred to as the fourth largest illegal trade after drugs, counterfeits, and human trafficking. And although, like any illegal trade, it's very hard to estimate the value, values certainly in the multiple billions of dollars a year are attributed to this business. It's often, for those involved, seen as a low-risk, high-profit business compared with other areas of illicit trade. And it's often linked to transnational organized crime. And although there's been particular emphasis on that in recent years, that's something that has plagued this area of commerce and the area of conservation concern for many years in the past. In terms of impacts, wildlife trade can threaten security and stability because of the involvement, particularly of organized crime. It can cause loss of resources, loss of tourism income and revenues, and obviously has massive risks to environmental and human health. And as we know, one of the major threats to biodiversity conservation, so conservation of nature, is overexploitation. And overexploitation is largely being regulated, controlled, or mitigated through laws. And of course, illegal trade is a way around those laws, and that's the way illicit business reacts to those regulations that are set up to achieve conservation gain. It also fuels corruption, and it has attracted organized crime. Wildlife trade is a global issue, and it's right that we often hear about charismatic species, charismatic megafauna, as people often say, like elephants and rhinos and tigers. And indeed, I'll draw on such examples in my presentation. But we must remember that wildlife trade happens locally within countries, illegal wildlife trade. It happens between countries within regions, as well as being an international issue. And it affects many species. This diversity of wildlife trafficking is really important to think about, and think about in the context also of what we're going to talk about today with transport. These are figures from the latest UN Office on Drugs and Crime World Wildlife Crime Report that Chris mentioned in his introduction. And it shows the variety of species involved, and particularly that are beyond the elephants and rhinos, pangolins we've heard. There's this report, for example, highlights major concern around the trade in valuable rosewoods, timbers that are used for making high-value furnitures, but also a wide range of species, from corals, big cats, sturgeon used for caviar and meat, tortoises and freshwater turtles, birds used in the pet trade. There's a whole range of species that can be subject to illegal trade. And also looking, these figures compare the first World Wildlife Crime Report with the most recent, released this year. And you also see the way this trade changes over time, different proportions of different species in trade, and the way business changes over time. That business obviously responding to availability, but also to demand. So because it's valuable trade, then it's really important to think about the financial flows in that trade. And this is just an example from the UN Office on Drugs and Crime World Wildlife Crime Report around the flows of money around illicit ivory trade from Africa to Asia. Again, I'll draw on that example today. Being look at as a valuable commodity, ivory, particularly as it's worked higher up the chain, but also just the flows of money in terms of large quantities of money, which is attracting organized crime into that business. Very significant markups, particularly in the trade part of the chain. And even though poachers are paid quite small amounts of money compared with those who are along the trade chain. So again, some areas of illegal wildlife trade, and not all, but some areas of that trade do attract organized crime. And organized crime obviously has this interface with corruption. And when we look at the transport sector in particular, and what happens along trade routes for illegal wildlife trade, there are different problems occurring along those trade routes. But one of the problems is corruption, so that the regulations that are in place, the controls that are exerted by police or forestry authorities or marine authorities in different countries, and on customs controls at either end of a trade chain, again, corruption can be a problem. Corruption in government sector, and of course, corruption in private sector. So let's get on to transport. So wildlife traffickers exploit transport supply chains because wildlife traffickers need transport supply chains. They're moving goods of different types within countries, between countries in the same region, and across the globe. And we hear a lot about particularly in recent years, the Africa-Asia, Africa-East Asia trade dimensions. And clearly there we're talking about transport supply chains that playing an important role in that. And businesses, or maybe legitimate businesses along those supply chains, of course, being exploited by illicit traders. What transport routes and what transport methods are used by different traders obviously depends a lot on the commodities. If you want to move some live parrots illegally from A to B across the globe, probably a shipping container is not, on a ship is not the way to do that. It's more likely to be concealment within luggage or on passenger's person and air transport. But there are other wildlife commodities that are durable, non-perishable commodities like ivory, like dried pangolin scales, like rhino horn, like timber, obviously, where slower, longer distance bulk movement is what the business needs, and this is where particularly the shipping sector comes into play. So one area of this concern clearly is for those bulk larger commodities is containerized sea cargo. And again, this is not new. The ivory trade has, just to use that example, has a long history, actually going back hundreds of years. And since the advent of and increase in containerized sea cargo, then container shipment movement of ivory has become a common phenomenon that we see from the seizures that are made by customs authorities around the world. In terms of containers, wildlife commodities, ivory, timber, others, are often concealed among other commodities. They're often misdeclared as another legal product. Maybe ivory may be declared as wood carvings or all sorts of different misdeclarations. There may be, particularly this is an issue with live animals, mixing with lookalike species, but that can be true for timber as well, that valuable rosewood may be declared as a less valuable species, is not subject to conservation controls. And then often there's documentation fraud around this and forging and alteration of permits. We heard about one convention at the beginning, but there's a convention very specifically focused on wildlife trade, the CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, where for many species, export documents, for some of them import documents, are required for legal movements of those wildlife shipments. So often that misdeclaration will be associated with forging and alteration of permits. So containerized sea cargo is a major route for illegal wildlife trade. But also, let's not forget that there are other areas of the maritime business to be concerned about. So cruise lines particularly, I was liking cruise ships arriving in cities or towns as like another city arriving, another city of potential consumers. And certainly there are areas of illegal wildlife trade, particularly those around the purchase of tourist curios, souvenirs like marine turtle products, where the business cruise passengers are a major driver of consumption, often become the majority consumers in a location, for example, a Caribbean island, and can have a major impact on demand. But also other areas of trade, those involved in shipping business obviously can be attracted to illicit business. There are examples where obviously concerns around illegal fishing, but also just occasionally it's also a matter of crew members around the maritime trade taking advantage of the fact that they're moving from A to B to trade something around the side. And that's been the case, for example, with things like illegal movements of parrots or primates, monkeys and apes, where crew members have been trading illicitly around the side of their normal business. So we need to think holistically about the maritime sector and also think along that trade chain, and that's what I'll come on to next. In terms of the trade chain, clearly ports are the critical place, so a critical point of intervention. And I'm not going to go into the detail now, but absolutely recognize this is complicated because this involves export locations This involves import locations, and it involves a range of locations where shipping comes in and out. And I know I should be careful with language with some maritime experts, but transit, transshipment, and that can take a variety of identities where that trade is moving into a territory or staying within a free trade zone or a customs zone, whether it's being unpacked and repacked or just a container moving through. But ports are a key place to look at intervention in the same way that airports are for the air trade. Similarly, when we look at the supply chains, we need to think about the multiple actors. So obviously shipping involves the booking of shipments, the development of access through freight agencies, customs brokers, obviously shipments, whether containerized or otherwise, are going through ports. They go through customs controls. There are a range of authorities involved there. Similarly, the different types of transport are going to be running through that system. I mentioned different types of the maritime trade. And then at the other end of the trade chain for international trade, again, port authorities, terminal operators, handlers, back through the customs system before something's released from the trade into the market. So there's a whole different set of actors, and I would certainly say that everyone has a role to play in potentially looking out for this problem in the trade chain. In terms of interventions, there's a whole range of things going on in the trade chain and that are being encouraged, and I just want to note that in terms of putting into context what the maritime sector, particularly the private sector, can do. But of course, there's a massive role for regulation, for authorities, for customs, nature conservation, police authorities in different countries. They're the ones with the power to arrest, the power to enforce. And at the other end of the trade, there's also a role for addressing consumers and trying to influence consumer behavior to reduce demand for illicit goods. But this role in the middle of what I refer to here as trade chain disruption, where the private sector can play a critical role in terms of trying to disrupt that trade chain to make it much more difficult for businesses, for illicit businesses to get involved and make it easier for licit or legal businesses to be involved, is absolutely critical. Just to highlight this before I close, that the impacts of this trade in terms of conservation terms, and I noted there are other impacts of illicit trade, of illegal wildlife trade, but in conservation terms, they can be catastrophic. So just to use this example, from during a 5-year period, that Tanzania lost 60% of its elephants to poaching and illegal trade. We know a lot about those trade chains, again, thinking about the ivory trade example. We know that because of seizures. We analyze seizures, and we can see what's traveling by air, what's traveling by courier, what's traveling by ship and container, and understand quite a lot about how that is working and how it changes over time. And I would just say, although we're seeing at the moment for illegal ivory trade some signs of some decline in the illegal trade, and suppression of price in the market and some strict action by market countries, particularly China. 2019 was a particular concern that the 3 largest shipments of ivory, illegal ivory, that have taken place in the last 20 years were picked up at shipping ports in containers going through Southeast Asia on the way to Vietnam and maybe onto the Chinese market. So shipping plays an absolutely critical role in that trade chain. Again, that's how that's happening with ivory is often through concealment. There are some examples here of various creative ways in which concealment takes place, either along with other goods or hidden within shipments. Often, interestingly, ivory is often hidden within timber shipments. There's a question then whether the timber itself was legal or illegal, but concerns around that. And just to note, again, in terms of the interventions, I mentioned the big seizures in 2019, the massive opportunity of using shipping documentation, the mine of information that is there in terms of mapping what has happened, tracing back those illegal trade routes, linking to where the money has come from, where the money is going to, and making these connections to try to break into these organized crime networks is absolutely critical. And again, a lot of the information there is in the hands of the businesses that are involved along the trade chain. Together, from business, making that link across to enforcement authorities, it can make a difference. It can drive enforcement action. Ultimately, that's going to reduce trafficking, linked to the efforts that are being made to reduce demand in end markets and reduce poaching in the case of elephants and illegal trade more generally. Just to say as I wrap up, so I should have introduced myself at the beginning, but I'll do that at the end. Traffic is an NGO, a non-governmental organisation specialising on wildlife trade. We do a lot of research around what's going on in terms of the patterns of wildlife trade and try to work with governments, but also with private sector and also with those who can reach out to consumers to try to address these issues. And again, looking forward to the questions and answers today. I hope that's a good introduction to why the maritime sector is so important to think about in the illegal wildlife trade space. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. And yeah, I think that was great. I think you sort of laid the foundation that it isn't, when you think of the maritime sector, it isn't just the ships carrying, it is the sort of the whole, as you say, the whole trade chain that is involved with it. And we've had a couple of questions. In fact, one came in this morning, which I'll ask, but I saw there's one from James Toon that's a good question, but that might be best answered by Nancy a bit later. So thanks, James. But the question for Steve that came in this morning was on, it's a bit around the corruption or security. So how to create mechanisms across the maritime supply chains to identify and protect those who are being forced to engage in IWT, either directly or indirectly. So we're talking about vulnerable individuals, women or youth, and in doing so, and the people are sort of forced into it. And then following up on that question, how do we better engage with those groups to gain information, extract information about the syndicates or the trafficking networks without compromising their safety?
Thanks. I think it's a really good question, really important question, and that's a very difficult topic, and it's a topic that cuts across other areas of illegal trade and illicit international business. And often the people who are caught when customs or other authorities pick up illegal shipments are often the people who've done some booking or a courier carrying something, and maybe they've been coerced into that role, or certainly naively walked into that role. And sometimes those are vulnerable people from vulnerable groups, and that's a major concern. The one thing I'd mention, there's a lot that can be done in this space in terms of understanding those people and trying to work out how, if people like that are caught through an enforcement action, how to protect them and encourage the passing of information, because all too often these sort of cases get stuck where the seizure's taken place and no one can quite work out who was the organised crime group behind that. But there's one extra thing that I would want to note, because it's particularly relevant to the business sector as well, is coming up with whistleblowing approaches. And this is something being very much promoted at the moment in the airline sector in a similar way, is how do you protect staff members or even passengers or others who come across information, they see something and they think, I want to pass on some information, but I don't want to jeopardize my own safety and security or my job in the case of an employee. And whistleblowing schemes are being developed in this space. And I think with that anonymity and protection for people, I think that's one clear thing that could be developed, particularly around the maritime sector, to protect people who may have information. And there's no doubt that the vulnerable groups are exploited in this business, and we need to think about how to focus the attention on those who are actually the organisers and who are profiting the most from it.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I think I completely agree. That makes sense. Yeah, that would be great to see more whistleblowing capability in this sector. And so another question that's come in, what can a bit of an extension of that? What can shipping lines and the broader shipping sector do to practically look out for possible IWT contraband in their shipments? So how can they improve their capability of identifying suspicious shipments?
Yeah, so I would stress again, we need to be careful that, you know, enforcement and catching criminals is the job of enforcement agencies, and you know, in encouraging action also by the private sector, it has to be set in that context. So the first thing is it's just the eyes and ears of being aware that this is an issue, it is a concern, and what to look out for. What are the sort of things of concern? Well, you know, is something that I've experienced in my business or experienced in my job, that I think that might be a concern. How do I check on that? You know, am I aware? So the awareness building, the education within the industry is really important. And then the next step is who to go to if I do have some information or I'm concerned about something. Who do I go to? Do I have the authority to go and speak to someone, or do I have to go and speak to my boss who's speaking to their boss who's speaking to their boss, and 3 weeks later it might get to someone in the customs agency? What's a system that allows me to act quickly? So I think it's establishing first and foremost the sort of knowledge, understanding, and the empowerment that people have, understand what they can do with information. I think that's probably the biggest thing, and then being very clear that the job of enforcement is with the enforcement agencies.
Brilliant, thanks. Yeah, thank you, Steve. That's very clear. And so another one, and topical, I think, for everyone here. Has there been any changes in IWT patterns since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, so obviously there's a lot of different factors at play in terms of, you know, how this pandemic has affected, well, all of us really, in terms of how the economies we work are operating. And, you know, illegal wildlife business sits in the same economic space. So transport is more difficult. Air transport has been more difficult. Consumers have not had the same levels of access to certain types of markets they may be familiar with. So we have seen some shifts. We see, you know, there's been a big shift to online retailing in this space in recent years. I think that seems to have become even more the case. In terms of air transport disruption, I'm sure that, you know, we see signs that has probably slowed down some illegal trade. It's made it more difficult, particularly for trade that needs to take place quickly, like live animal trade. But one of the other areas we see, and where, you know, the motivations for those who are so close to live with the wildlife that there's a concern here, is sure, maybe we've seen some markets suppressed because of the pandemic, because there's not the same buying power or the same transport opportunity. But in many countries, we also see more people losing their jobs. We see unemployed people who are just desperate for something to do to feed their families, to make a living. And you know, so there are a number of places. Traffic's done some research in India, for example, where we're seeing increased poaching of wild animals because of lack of economic alternatives. So whether those people find the markets and actually make the money they think they're going to make is not what they know when they make that choice up front. But there's been disruption in a number of ways, and clearly it's going to take some time to see how that plays out over time, and how economic recovery, transport access, consumer confidence for some of these commodities, whether luxuries in particular, how that will change over time. But there have been some changing dynamics. Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. And yeah, as you say, we're still very much in the grip of the pandemic. So, you know, and these statistics often take quite a long time to come out. So I guess the next question, and it's a slight extension from that. And you had a really good slide showing some of the movement corridors, or typical trend movement corridors, and you know, we typically see going from Africa to Asia, you know, is the main the flow of the stream, really. So you know, in that respect, how has China's we've seen a lot of publicity about China's recent ivory and pangolin ban, and some of these new legislation that's been on the back of COVID-19 certainly has accelerated on the back of it. You know, how has China's ivory and pangolin ban impacted trafficking?
Yeah, so it's very hard to say that one factor sits above all other factors. So if I look at ivory trade as that example, clearly a lot of things have happened in the past, some decades trying to control this trade, but particularly over the last 5 years with lots of pressure for countries along the trade chain to take stronger enforcement action. There's been a process under CITES called the National Ivory Action Plan. So I don't want to discount the fact that other countries have taken action, both at the producer and transit parts of the market. But certainly I believe that China's strengthened ban on and closure of its legal domestic market of ivory, which is based on stocks that were imported in the past, that has had an impact. It sent a very clear message in China to consumers. It's empowered enforcement authorities. And from what we can see over the past couple of years, there has been a reduction in price in the Chinese market. There are signs that consumers are responding to that. And there are signs that illegal trade flows have been declining. But again, it's it would be too early to say that's definitely changed the dynamic overall. There are some positive signs. With pangolins, actually, pangolin trade, international pangolin trade, again, has been banned for quite some years. And the big challenge in China has been that there have been pangolin scales are used in medicine. Dried pangolin scales are durable, and old stocks have been allowed to be sold. And of course, that provides some opportunity for laundering. So there have been some shifts in policy. There are some questions about exactly how clear that shift in policy is around the medicinal trade in particular. But again, there are some positive shifts in terms of China's market share. And the biggest thing China's done this year in response to the pandemic is with regard to the wild meat trade, is to ban consumption of wild meat. And we're trying to see at the moment how that is impacting some of the illegal and legal wildlife trade flows in China.
Yeah, thanks. As you say, yeah, the wild meat trade, bush meat for airlines is huge popularity, for tackling because of what we're going through. So, Steve, that's fantastic. We've got a few questions, but I think that the others lined up here are probably more for the other panelists. But there's one in particular we could ask when we get everyone together. But I think that was great to give everyone a good insight into why we're here, the importance of doing it now, and things like that. So thank you, Steve. So that cues us up for the next session, and here we're going to have two speakers, and then we'll go into another Q&A period of all three speakers. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Nancy Karangitu, who is the Principal Secretary of State Department for Shipping and Maritime at the Ministry of Transport, Infrastructure, Housing, Urban Development and Public Works in the Government of Kenya. And our second speaker is Alan Jorgensen, who's the Head of Sustainable Trade in Maersk. But Nancy, if you could take us through the proposal. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to start by thanking Steve Broad for that excellent background and insights. So fellow panelists, moderator, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to all of you. On behalf of the Kenya government and the people of Kenya, I wish to start by expressing our appreciation for the opportunity to join this webinar so that we may share our views and proposals towards accelerating action against wildlife trafficking in international maritime supply chains. Kenya and the Eastern African region in general takes pride in a diverse, rich habitat with a diversity of wildlife that has garnered international fame, especially for its populations of large mammals, the most important or famous species of which are commonly referred to as the Big Five. Conservation is a cornerstone of the region's economy. Next slide, please. Okay, wildlife trafficking has proved to be a persistent global problem with the potential for causing diminishing species populations and causing extinction at local and global levels. There is urgent need, therefore, for all of us to do whatever it takes to mitigate this sad state of affairs, and as the maritime community, we must stand up to be counted. Trade in illegal wildlife is one of the 5 most lucrative global crimes, with an estimated worth of $50 to $150 billion per year, which has led to poaching and trade in wild animals reaching global crisis levels, with some species almost being hunted to extinction for their ivory, for their horns, skin, teeth, and other products. It is estimated that 72 to 90% of illegal wildlife products by volume are illicitly trafficked by sea as a result of criminal groups and networks abusing international seagoing vessels to conduct this illegal trade. Despite this level of significant abuse, however, there has so far not been any IMO instrument deliberately targeting combating wildlife trafficking in the maritime sector. It is therefore in the face of this acute global crisis affecting the world's wildlife that is partially driven by illegal trade in wildlife products. The observation that considerable volumes of wildlife products are trafficked by sea, and further recognizing the role of the shipping industry in global trade and the global economy, that the need to develop guidelines for the prevention and suppression of smuggling of wildlife on ships engaged in international maritime traffic cannot be understated. Such a move will help highlight the need to address wildlife trafficking as the serious organized transnational crime that it actually is. Next, please. The proposed guidelines that we are going to speak about today are intended to contribute to certain issues, and we are saying that the proposed guidelines are consistent with and in line with the objectives and priorities of the International Maritime Organization. In particular, we see the guidelines as assisting the IMO's contribution to a number of global initiatives, the first one being the attainment of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals 15 and 16, which focus on life on land and peace, justice, and strong institutions, respectively. We see the guidelines addressing commitments made to the Buckingham Palace Declaration, United for Wildlife Task Force, the region's JIDA Code of Conduct, JIDA amendments to the Djibouti Code of Conduct, which happened in 2017 and for which IMO is the depository, and which call for cooperation to repress transnational organized crime, of which trade in wildlife is among others. The guidelines also align with the implementation of the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wildlife, Fauna and Flora, also known as the CITES, Resolution 314 of the 69th United Nations General Assembly on Tackling Illicit Trafficking in Wildlife, the IMO International Ship and Port Facility Security Code, ILO/IMO Code of Practice on Security in Ports, and the World Customs Organization Safe Framework of Standards to Secure and Facilitate Global Trade. Next, please. Now, I want to start looking at the structure of the proposed guidelines. And in order to contribute to the prevention of or minimize wildlife trafficking, it is proposed that the IMO develops guidelines for the prevention and suppression of the smuggling of wildlife on ships engaged in international traffic within a proposed framework, which we propose to be structured as follows. Chapter 1, providing for the prevention of illicit trafficking in wildlife, and intended to include the following. 1, structured cooperation between ship's crews and shipping companies as well as competent authorities so as to detect and deter wildlife trafficking. Also to put in place measures for the prevention and detection of wildlife trafficking for cargo, ports, as well as personnel. Procedures for assessment of ships' vulnerability to wildlife trafficking, taking into account the methods known to have been used by traffickers to conceal illegal wildlife in legal cargo on board ships, and also provide for capacity building through education and training for crews as well as port staff so that they are better placed to detect and prevent illicit wildlife trafficking, and also provide for methods to detect illicit wildlife concealment in cargo and on board ships. Next. As well as what I have just said also, we propose that we shall have a second chapter on control of the transport of wildlife in order to include the best international and national practices and measures to control wildlife trade based on recommendations by countries affected by illicit wildlife trade including source and destination countries. We propose to provide two annexes to the proposed guidelines. Annex 1 will provide internet sites that will provide information updated from time to time related to international and national legislations on the subject, and also keep a constant flow of statistics on seizures and other situations involving trafficking of wildlife, a bit similar to piracy information sharing processes that have been very useful in the enhancement of maritime security. Next slide, please. We also propose Annex 2. Annex 2 proposes to provide an up-to-date list of the most trafficked wildlife species, their products and derivatives, through shipping by geographic regions, and such lists to include information such as the descriptions of the particular species and their derivatives, a review of concealment methods used by criminals for maritime trafficking, and a list also of affected countries, including source and destination countries. Annex 2, of course, will need to be kept updated regularly because wildlife trafficking patterns may change from time to time. Next slide, please. Now, what are the proposed, or what do we see as the benefits expected to accrue from these guidelines? And we are saying, and we are foreseeing that the proposed guidelines will yield the following benefits. That is to say, create structures for and enhance cooperation between the shipping lines and government agencies, including ports, in the combat of transnational criminal groups and networks engaged in illegal wildlife trade. The guidelines should also help decrease illicit wildlife trafficking through maritime shipping, especially in countries heavily affected by such crime, and directly contribute to the survival and conservation of wildlife species heavily targeted by illicit wildlife trade, such as elephants, rhinos, pangolins, and many others. They should also reduce opportunities for corruption in the maritime sector through information flows, thus creating transparency. Should also reduce exposure to economic and legal risks for shipping companies and ship's crew from illicit trafficking. And in the backdrop of the ongoing coronavirus, it's important to note that the measures proposed will help contribute to the prevention of exposure to future pandemics that may be associated with illegal wildlife trade, and some of which that Steve has mentioned. Next, please. The urgency, how urgent are these measures? I want to say and submit that there are very compelling reasons for the guidelines to be put in place as a matter of urgency, for the simple reason that wildlife is a finite resource, and continued poaching at current levels foreseen will lead to extinction of target species. Time is not on our side, and as custodians of the world's resources for the benefit of future generations, and in order to ensure their sustainable use by the current generation, we must take action now. It is for this reason, therefore, that document FAL, or Facilitation Convention, meeting the FAL 44/18-1, proposes a new IMO output under the heading of Guidelines for the Prevention and Suppression of the Smuggling of Wildlife on Ships Engaged in International Maritime Traffic. The document will be presented during the upcoming 44 FAL virtual meeting for consideration by the FAL committee, the meeting which is scheduled to be held next week from 28 September to 2nd October 2020 under Agenda Item 18, Work Programs and Outputs. Next, please. So what is the way forward in terms of the guidelines? I want to express great hope that distinguished members will give the proposed paper reference FAL 44/18/1 the favorable consideration that it deserves for adoption. It goes without saying, however, that the proposed guidelines will first be put through a consultative process involving all relevant stakeholders, including but not limited to shipping lines, the shippers, both exporters and importers, government and port agencies, relevant international organizations, as well as non-governmental organizations. And like I mentioned before, that list is by no means exhaustive. So distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to thank you all for your kind attention and humbly look forward to your support towards these noble proposals made for the sake of posterity. I submit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nancy. I thought that was fantastic. It's a really welcome report. And just before I hand over to Alan, I particularly like the geographical list of the most trafficked wildlife species. So why look for all species when actually certain ports are only susceptible to a certain number? I think that's a really good addition, really, that goes with an extension of the CITES lists. But thank you for that. We'll come back for real questions shortly. Alan, who's the head of sustainable trade at Maersk, is going to take us through the private sector. Thanks. Over to you, Alan.
Thanks very much, Rob. And thank you to the host for allowing me to speak on this important webinar. I think it's an extremely positive development that we are witnessing here in terms of the plans that have just been laid out by my colleague from Kenya. So I look forward to giving a perspective from the private sector on this on behalf of Maersk. While I cannot speak for other private sector members of United for Wildlife, I will try to give an impression also on what we are collaborating on in the transport sector task force. But just to be clear up front, I mean, we, along with the other membership as shipping companies, we're fully committed to helping combat illegal wildlife trade. We believe that if we work together in the private sector, but crucially between the private and public sectors and the NGO community, there's a lot we can do. There's also a lot more we can do. So the proposal to have this guidance to sort of ensure that we all sing from the same hymn sheet is very important. Just if you can, Mary, move to the next slide. A few words about the company I represent. I think the key message here is Maersk is a global integrator of container logistics. We're the biggest container shipping company in the world. We're also the third biggest port operator company in the world. So we do see this from a variety of perspectives, and I recognize everything that's been said by Steve and Nancy in terms of the patterns that we're seeing and the kinds of challenges that we experience in this area. As an enabler of global trade, we want to facilitate trade that is sustainable. So anything we can do to avoid our network and our services being misused for illicit purposes, including illegal wildlife trade, is something we're deeply committed to doing. And also because, as we have heard, illegal wildlife trade is often tied in with a nexus, a host of other sustainability challenges, going all the way up to deforestation and climate change, if you will. So there is, we're not just talking about something here that happens in isolation, and I think that is very important to make that point. Global supply chains are only as strong as their weakest link, and I think many of you in the virtual room here today understand the degree of interconnectedness of the maritime industry in terms of how networks function together. So it's a really important exercise if we are to make the net more finely masked, if you will, to catch illegal wildlife traffickers do so in a concerted one area, there will still be lots of ways in the network that illegal practices can continue. That's why one of the reasons why in 2015 Maersk joined the United for Wildlife Transport Sector Task Force and became a signatory of the Buckingham Declaration, Buckingham Palace Declaration. If you move to the next slide, Mary, where today in the Transport Sector Task Force, the membership actually comprises more than half of global maritime container shipping volumes. So we have a huge share of the global network in behind these principles, but crucially we don't have all of the network behind these principles, including some of the port sector and crucially also the much more fragmented inland transportation networks. But the Buckingham Palace Declaration is for us the Bible, if you will, of what we are trying to do in combating illegal wildlife trade. Of course, having a zero tolerance approach is the starting point. Making sure that our staff, leaders, but also frontline staff are aware of the problems and how to raise issues, as has been mentioned very correctly, focusing particularly on the hotspots, because it is an important point that whereas you can never rule out that this can be a global phenomenon, we also know the main trafficking routes. So obviously our staff in those areas, whether that be in origin countries or transshipment countries or destination countries, they need to be extra aware and extra alert that this can happen. Information sharing is an ongoing point that I will also return to, which also has to do with the ongoing digitization of our sector in terms of being able to better screen for what may look suspicious. Maersk has in its global network around 4 million containers, receiving tens of thousands of bookings per day. So this is very much a practice of looking for the needle in the haystack. And this is an area where we are first to admit that we are by no means perfect. So for us as a private actor, it is really, really important also to know our limitations. And I believe one of the previous speakers said something like, we as private actors, we shouldn't go and catch criminals. Now, there's a lot we can do to help the legitimate authorities to undertake enforcement action. And that's where we, from experience, can see that the Transport Sector Task Force has been most successful. And also that is the area where we as Maersk believe we have the most to contribute. So that means whenever there is a request from
Alan, I'm just going to say you've frozen. If you can hear me, let's try and get you back. Okay, so if he's down a bit longer, we might go to a question or two with Nancy while we try and get Alan back. Okay, so in the meantime, let's jump to a question. Let's jump to a question for Nancy. Nancy, are you okay to take a question quickly now, and then we might answer that and then try and go back to Alan to finish his presentation when we can. So I've got at the top of a couple of questions for you. I had one. I think it's a bit more clarity on the guidelines. Will the guidelines affect only international shipping companies? And that also sort of flows in. We've had a question with a lot of upvotes. Will the guidelines include both fauna and flora? So, are you okay to take that?
Yes. I'm with you.
Thank
you asked whether the guidelines will only affect fauna and flora. Oh.
Yeah, so the question would be, will the guidelines affect only international shipping companies? And then in part 2 of that question, will it also include both fauna and flora? So effectively, is it both animals and plants and things?
Okay, let me start by saying that if approved by FAL 24, the proposed guidelines will be developed in collaboration with all stakeholders, including government agencies, international shipping lines, port-based stakeholders, international organizations and NGOs, like I said. Successful control of wildlife trafficking in the maritime sector can only be undertaken in strong and coordinated collaboration between law enforcement agencies, private sector, and other relevant stakeholders. And the key function, moreover, of shipping lines is to support and implement international trade. And I'm glad that Alan said not just international trade, but also sustainable international trade. But therefore only through a balanced and coordinated approach with clear roles for each maritime actor can make this legitimate commercial trade free from wildlife trafficking. Now, as to what else the guidelines will address at this time, we may need a special guidelines to address other issues, because approaches to address the issue might be quite different if it's fauna and flora, and the methods used to curb wildlife trafficking. But again, like I said, it will be a very consultative process with IMO member states, and I may not be able to see how far the ambit will be. I submit.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's clear. Thank you, Nancy. So I think, Alan, we've got you back. So sorry about all that. Hopefully we can continue where you left off.
No, I'm sorry, Rob, for dropping the connection there, and I'm not sure when you last heard from me, but no. So the crux of the matter for us is that we've been working with this for a number of years now, and there's no doubt that from what we're seeing, where we can be most effective is to actually support and enable the enforcement actions that are undertaken by authorities in origin, transit, and destination countries on this. So having that sort of overarching framework, even more coordinated, even more systematically orchestrated, as is proposed by Nancy and in the proposed guidance, is going to be a huge step forward. I can say what we are working on in relation to the transport sector task force is to make better use of some of the strides that are being made in terms of digitization of global shipping information. So in having access to bookings, bills of lading, etc., in digital form gives us new opportunities to also screen for red flags. And we're standing at the cusp of a development there. So if across the private sector and the public sector, and there I'm thinking about customs authorities, border agencies particular, if we can make sure that we look for the same patterns and share the same information about criteria for red flags, etc., then I believe we have come a long way. So it's really just to reiterate that for us it's not a silver bullet, but that is indeed the correct way of moving forward. So we very much welcome the proposed guidance with the clear indication that as a shipping company or a port operator, we're a mailman, we're not a policeman, so we would like to do our bit, but we much prefer doing so in a clearly regulated framework where authorities take the driver's seat in combating this problem. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. So yeah, I don't know. I think we lost where we were on the slides, but that's you finished for the presentation? Just marrying them both up. Are you happy to take questions now? Brilliant.
Yes.
Okay, so if I'll welcome Nancy and Steve back, and we can do a questions to all three panelists. So thank you for all your questions. I think we've done one with Nancy. Alan, I might go to you. And we had a question on, I guess it was, so around what are the existing international cooperation mechanisms which can be leveraged to support the prevention of international wildlife trafficking? I mean, you mentioned, the United for Wildlife Transport Task Force, but could you talk to us a bit about some of the work you've been doing in that respect?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. So some of the priorities in that collaboration are around finding ways to detect red flags, as has been showed in the previous presentations. The problem we face is misdeclaration. So as a shipping company, we don't open the containers, but we have access to shipping information, manifests, bills of lading, etc. And as that information is becoming more digital, we can also mine it in a more effective manner. So this is an effort we are collaborating on in the task force currently to see how do we best compare knowledge and information within the industry. This also extends to seeing how we can collaborate on exchanging information on persons and entities who have been implicated in previous seizures and previous trafficking incidents, again, to make sure that we can make it as hard as possible for these individuals.
That's great, thanks, Alan. And just continuing on that technology, Steve, it's sort of almost continues on from there, but I've had a question on technology has an important role to play here as a force multiplier. Can we level out the playing field? There's a lot of interesting work being done around scanning devices and AI. What other initiatives are there around investing in and applying technology improvements where we can see development?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. The nature of organised crime there is often one step ahead of those who are trying to chase it up. And there's definitely a place for technology. You mentioned scanners, image auto detection. There's some work on this with airline luggage at the moment, looking at how you can use auto detection algorithms to see what images show. There is use of scanners, obviously, for some container shipping. There's also things like air extraction from containers that then sniffer dogs are used, and eventually we'll get onto using electronic sniffer dogs, basically, for such examination of containers. And also another technological that's really important is around species identification, and rather than having to wheel in an expert with their books, to be able to use mobile phone-based image analysis for identification of timber, what species is it from, what animals are from. So there's a really important part for technology, but I would just stress also that getting the basic rights is so important, and that's what picks up on Alan's point, that there's a lot there in the documentation, and the ability to use red flags I know Traffic and WWF are collaborating at the moment on some red flag indicators, a sort of compendium of red flag indicators we hope to make available for use by those who can pick up such information within the business, as well as on the enforcement side of things. So that's really important. And then when it comes to enforcement action, again, the basics, following the money and getting beyond the fact that something was booked with a shipping agent by someone we don't know who they were, and it was consigned to someone now we can't work out who they are. That's the end of the case. There's a seizure, which is good. It's out of the trade, but the follow through on investigations at both ends as well is basic policing. So technology, absolutely, but we need to get the basics right.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And I think that backs up Alan's point around the collaboration, the importance of collaboration, the whole sort of supply chain coming together to sort of build a case. I'm actually going to bring in someone external now. We've had a sort of a request for our US alternate representative from the IMO to have a verbal intervention. So I'd like to welcome Tim Haynes to speak now, if we can make the technology work.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, got you now. Thank you, Tim.
Okay, great. So good afternoon, and thank you for organizing this important event today. The US government has a strong record of engagement and leadership to fight wildlife crime globally, and we welcome the opportunity to further strengthen these efforts by tackling wildlife trafficking in the maritime sector. The United States is supportive of Kenya's proposal to the IMO Facilitation Committee to develop guidelines to combat maritime wildlife trafficking. Through the US Task Force on Wildlife Trafficking, the United States takes a whole of government approach and works across multiple agencies, drawing on extensive technical expertise, including for law enforcement investigations, capacity building programs, customs, border and port inspections, and utilizing our laws to prosecute traffickers. We recognize that combating wildlife trafficking in the maritime sector is a crucial frontier and look forward to working with Kenya, the IMO, the private sector, and other organizations to deprive transnational criminal networks of their wildlife trafficking routes. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. I appreciate that, and it's good to hear from you guys. So a question I might go to Nancy now. We've had a couple of questions. So it was again on will the proposed guidelines address legal, unreported and unregulated fishing? Nancy, are you okay to take that?
Thank you. Let me start by thanking Mr. Tim Haynes for his statement and that expression of support. Thank you so much, as well as Alan for that very elucidatory statement and presentation. Thank you so much, and we look forward to working and collaborating to make these proposals work and protect sustainable trade. Now, I want to say that the guidelines will probably not address the issue of illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing, because looking at that issue, looks like we might need special IMO guidelines to address the IUU, because approaches to address this very serious issue may take a different angle from the methods that we need to use to curb wildlife as proposed, wildlife trafficking as proposed in the guidelines. And again, let me just say, like I said before, this is not for us to say as the Kenya government. We've made the proposals, but the decisions will be best taken through the IMO consultative process involving all member states and also partners in the process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nancy. Yeah, that's very clear. What I might do actually is I've got a question here that's been answered in the question answer box, but I think it's worth bringing up. It was James from EIA has put it in. So I might address this to both Alan and Nancy. And Alan, if you want to have a go at it first from the shipping sort of point of view, and Nancy from a sort of government side. But it's around it's around corruption and the association with trafficking on maritime routes. So it's often private businesses or individuals at clearing agents that act as a one-stop shop, and these are frequented by traffickers for ensuring that their illicit commodities move through customs unchecked, working to corrupt officials for this purpose. What can be done to regulate and scrutinise further role of clearing agents? And Alan, I'll be clear that this is obviously isn't your sector, but I would be really interested in your view from the other side of the port, I guess, is, these things are coming onto your ships. What do you sort of think about that? And then Nancy, from your side, be interested in on the policy or the government thought around, securing the whole clearing agent part. Does that make sense? So Alan, do you want to go first?
Yeah. No, thanks, Rob, and thanks for the question. I think we'd be fooling ourselves if we didn't also talk about corruption as one of the root causes, as it is in many cases, and in many other on many other issues. Corruption is at play here in some of the countries that we're discussing. So this is also something we encounter within the maritime sector. We have an initiative called the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network, where we are reporting whenever there's a request for facilitation payments, for example, towards one of our entities or staff. Then we report it into the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network, and that has over time proven to be quite effective. It is also true that in some of the land-based sectors that you don't have that kind of overarching initiative, and that's often where we see some of the problems. It's often said that maybe over time increased digitization will make it more difficult to engage in these practices, and that's something we remain hopeful of. We recently made a decision to suspend timber shipments out of a West African country where it was blatantly obvious that permits being granted were questionable. So, and we feel it's not our job again to police this, but there are instances where it becomes very obvious, and therefore we were compelled to act in that. In that circumstance. So yes, corruption is very much at the root cause of what we're discussing here, and needs to be key to any discussion going forward also.
Thanks, Alan. Nancy, are you okay to give your perspective?
Yes, thank you. And I want to say that the reason that the government of Kenya is proposing these guidelines is because it puts all of us on an even keel, because some of the measures proposed, and it's a good thing that we are working through such a convention like FAO with its standardized ways of doing work, is going to really help address this problem, particularly in bringing transparency. And if you look at the proposals that we've made, there'll be internet sites that will provide information relating to the legislation in both the local and the international sphere. And also the naming, keeping information about where certain practices are happening. The internet is now a village, and therefore nobody would want to, or rather it would be a deterrent factor to have this information on a site where everybody is seeing. The other issue is the sharing of information, the capacity building, the education among the different players, having them with the capacity to be able to discern, to be able to determine what's happening, and to also create patterns to know that, like Alan had said, they've stopped timber trade from certain areas because over time they've built up the information that this is a hotspot. And I believe that all these are good measures in bringing clarity and bringing transparency, building robust capacity among the players in the industry to be able to understand and to know what's happening, and also to speak boldly I like the whistleblowing issues. I mean, somebody talked of as a measure, previous speaker. And I think all of these measures, as long as we bring them out in the open and we deal with them in an open manner, in a transparent manner, and in a, you know, in a manner that is predictable, they will all go towards addressing the problem also of corruption. Having standardized documentation, enforcement, all these are going to build and give us robust interdictions against these offenses. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, and it's encouraging. It's also really encouraging, Alan. You made a really good point around that. You know, your company has seen suspicious shipments coming out of a specific region to the extent where they've just said, you know, no more from that region. One, that's encouraging that you're able to you know, have a risk indicator that suggests, you know, how to spot them, and two, that, you know, companies like yours take decisive action and say, you know, no more. So that's really, I think that's brilliant to hear about, and I think important for our audience. I do have another quick, it's going to be a quick one from Nancy. I realise we're down to our last probably 3 minutes. So Nancy, it was just around a timeline for the proposal. So is there a timeline for the proposed policy implementations in Kenya? I presume it's got to go through FAO 44 before anything is decided.
Yes, as soon as we get these timelines, I mean the guidelines measured, or rather approved, we will be able to set up the mechanisms in place to have them implemented, because we've got the institutional frameworks that implement the national, I mean FAO at a national level, and therefore once they are decided, we'll be able to take them through that structure, which comprises both private and government players in the sector. And I hope that as soon as we get them, we will be able to use the mechanism in place to be able to sensitize and also implement them in Kenya. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you, Nancy. So I think if we call that your final question, we've got time for a sort of wrap up, I suppose, from Steve and Alan. Steve, a question for you. You know, we talked briefly, and we about COVID-19 and its disruption, and we probably won't see those impacts or effects for a little while yet. But can you give us a rough, you know, outline of what we might expect? You know, with proposals like this Kenya IMO proposal, you know, it's encouraging. It seems like, you know, progress is being made. You know, yes, there is a bit of time to go, but things do seem to be looking up. Can you give us sort of an outlook to sort of close? And Alan, I'll ask you another question in a second.
Yeah, I mean, first I'd say it's great to hear Nancy's presentation today, and absolutely commend the Kenyan government for moving this forward. It's a great action to take, and I hope it really gets picked up in the government sector. It's also great to be joined here with Alan and hear example of private sector action, which is really critical and needs to be very clear. It's important right across the trade chain. Yeah, I think, you know, there's no doubt one of there's many things unexpected about this pandemic, but obviously the association that's been made, however tenuous that might be in some ways, to wildlife trade itself, has raised the profile of wildlife trade and of the health risks from wildlife trade, as well as the conservation risks. And I think that spotlight is an additional spotlight on wildlife trade, which is not going to go away. I think it will stay, and it will stay a matter of concern. So I certainly, in terms of wrapping this, certainly have a hope that from all sectors, but NGO, government, private sector, that this leads to more action, more scrutiny of what's going on in this trade, and more scrutiny of what's going on with the illegal trade, where that avoidance of regulation is what is causing big health risks as well as the conservation concerns. So yeah, I'm certainly hoping to see a concerted push forward from here, and great to hear this initiative from the Kenyan government. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you, Stephen. And Alan, your sort of final question for me, and it builds a bit on what Steve was saying. It's this sort of momentum. The shipping sector, it seems, you know, has all sorts of initiatives like the Box Club, or it's these collaboration between the shipping sector to come together. Do you think that wildlife trafficking, or let's call it environmental issue, you know, crime, is growing? The momentum is growing, and we are likely to see real progress. I mean, again, on these technology projects that you mentioned, and I know MSc are also doing something similar. It's really encouraging. Is that an accurate representation of what's happening in the sector?
I think it might be. I mean, there's a growing focus on sustainability wholesale and on climate change, and as part of that, illegal wildlife trade is part of that focus. It's also a sector that is fairly consolidated if you compare with other sectors. So, and I think the IMO is an exemplar of that. It can be a very effective platform if you get the timing right to really move an issue forward. And I think this is an issue that most companies will not have a problem with stepping up to. And I think the experience of the Transport Sector Task Force has showed that, where today we have more than half of the global maritime container volume in there signed up to these principles, and we can easily go to the next stage there. So yes, I am optimistic, and I think, going back to the image that the transport link is sort of what binds the supply and the demand side of this problem together. The IMO can be an effective convener of what is essentially a discussion among origin and transit and destination countries about making collaboration more robust in this area. And I think it's very positive if this initiative can lead to that, and then certainly we in the private sector are very much on board with that, and will happily contribute to the discussion.
Oh, brilliant! Thank you, Alan, and thank you all the speakers. It seemed to me that the sort of some of the core themes of it was throughout this session, if we can summarise such a great topic, is collaboration and technology. I guess it's the collaboration not just within the maritime supply chain, but as Steve brought up, and Alan, it's with law enforcement, it's with the investigative agencies, so that if a seizure is made, that is targeted. The people that facilitated arrested. It's not just the sort of mules on the ground. So it's collaboration on that point, and then the technology, the development of processes to spot suspicious activity, at point of booking or whatever it is, so that it becomes a sort of business as usual. This isn't a we get one up. So yeah, thank you for all the speakers. That really leaves me just to thank you guys for your time and your points. I'd also like to thank, crucially, the organisers of this webinar who've been working tirelessly for the last couple of weeks. So the Traffic, IMO, UNDP and WWF of helping to deliver this amazing session. Thank you to all of you, the audience, for joining us, and for some of these questions. The questions that weren't answered, we'll endeavour to push out to the panellists, and if we can get an answer, we'll include it on the email, where we'll send out to all people who have registered, as well as a recording of the webinar itself. So once again, thanks Alan, thanks Steve, thanks Nancy, really appreciate. Thank you Chris at the beginning, and Tim for your insight, and thank you all to the audience. Goodbye.
Goodbye, thank you so much.
Thank you everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye everyone.
Okay.
And thank you very much to Rob Campbell.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.